Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme. The International Criminal Court issues arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant for alleged war crimes in Gaza. Well, the ICC has also issued a warrant for the Hamas military leader Mohammed Deif. Dozens of people are feared dead in northern Gaza following fresh Israeli strikes. Rescuers in the town of Beit Lahia fear many casualties are buried beneath the rubble. Russia is reported to have launched an intercontinental ballistic missile at Ukraine. If confirmed, this will be the first known use of this powerful weapon since the war began. And as Poland scrambles fighter jets close to the Ukrainian border, we ask, are we seeing the beginnings of an expansion of this conflict? Welcome to the programme. We're going to begin with the news that the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant. Well, the Hague-based court issued the warrant alleging war crimes in Gaza, saying it has reasonable grounds to believe that the leaders committed those crimes. Well, the court's announcement follows deadly Israeli strikes that hit crowded neighbourhoods. Dozens of people are feared dead in the latest attack near the Kamal Adwan hospital, which is in the town of Beit Lahia, and another in the Sheikh Radwan neighbourhood of Gaza City. Well, the latest strikes follow the US veto of a ceasefire at the UN Security Council last night. Well, for more on all of this, I'm joined now by Manuel Hassassian, who is the Palestinian ambassador to Denmark. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Ambassador. We've had reaction from Israel to this news of the arrest warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister and his former Defence Minister. The Israeli government calls it absurd. The Israeli President says it's outrageous. What's your reaction?
Well, first of all, let me react to your initial report about the killing of so many people in Beit Lahia, especially during, early this morning and around Mustashfa Kamal Adwan. 88 martyrs have been, killed as a result of this ferocious attack, let alone at Sheikh Radwan, as you have mentioned. And many of the Gazans are still under the rubble. We don't know the actual end result of all these killings. And of course, can we call this genocide or not? This is a question for the international community that has been bolstering the Palestinian position that what Israel is doing is a genocide, and this genocide should go unpunished. And one of the immediate repercussions of such policies that have been inflicted upon the Palestinians in Gaza, especially, is the war crimes that have been committed by Benjamin Netanyahu and ex-Defense Minister Gallant. And I'm not surprised to see today the ICC coming out with this indictment of both as war criminals, let alone one goes to Mohammed Deif, who has been assassinated as a leader of Hamas by the Israelis. Of course, we expect an outraged reaction by the Israelis, and of course, it is so evident that they will use questions like anti-Semitism, that all these are pack of lies. It is absurd. Israel is defending itself. And, unfortunately, that the United States has been, yesterday just vetoed down a ceasefire in Gaza, and they are now attacking the ICC. Congress is threatening the ICC in not implementing, such a decision of indictment about Netanyahu and Gallant. And some European countries have been, not supporting this decision. Others are being silent about it, and others being, supportive of such a decision. What do we expect after 410 days of constant bombing and killing and starvation, with no fuel, no electricity, no medication, no food,
Sure, Ambassador, I'm going to raise some of those points. Let me just pick up on some of the points you've been making, because you raise a lot of interesting points. Let's just break this down a little bit. I mean, I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that one of the few things that Hamas and Israel have ever agreed on is their condemnation of this decision by the ICC, because Hamas has also expressed outrage at the fact that Mohammed Deif has been named by the ICC. You say he's dead, but do we actually know for sure that he's dead?
Well, actually, all the reports, all the evidences that we have personally that have been collected, by the Palestinians, that yes, he is dead. And if he is dead, I mean, okay, if they issue a warrant in terms of Mohammed Deif, Hamas has, like Israel, basically would say that the people of Gaza, along with the Hamas resistance, are defending themselves. But actually, if you compare the rhetoric that comes out from Israel after 410 days of actual bombing, starvation, and killing, and to come and say that this is not a government of genocide, it is really absurd not to admit the fact that what has been going on for the last 400 days is total genocide. As far as Hamas is concerned, Hamas is also considered terrorist by the international community. And if there is an allegation against them concerning Mohammed Deif, he has been assassinated. So it becomes null and void as far as they are concerned. But actually, when we talk about the current regime in Israel with Netanyahu and ex-defense minister Gallant, let alone this Ben-Gvir-Smotrich government, should be held accountable. And that's why the ICC's decision has been received with outrage and with total, with a repugnant attitude from Israel and from the Prime Minister's office. It's something natural.
Okay, we're going to come to that. We're going to come to that in a second. But I just want to finish discussing Mohammed Deif with you, because he's accused by the ICC of torture, rape, taking hostages, murder. Do you condemn him?
Well, these are the allegations of the Israelis. We don't know whether
this is what the ICC said
was behind it or not. And what evidence do I have personally to tell you about Mohammed Deif, except that he is a leader in Hamas? But to accuse him and make him accountable for what happened on October 7th, I don't have the evidence enough, to indict him or at least to condemn what he has done. So I cannot answer this question. I'm sorry.
But the ICC has named him specifically at the same time as issuing these warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant. So don't we need to look at both sides of the coin here?
We are looking at both sides of the coin. And if Mohammed Deif has been inducted by the ICC, they should have proof. They should, give us the evidence to prove that he was directly involved in the massacres of October 7th.
Let's be clear. It's not very likely, is it, that Benjamin Netanyahu or Yoav Gallant are going to face a court at The Hague, is it?
I don't think so. First of all, the United States will do its utmost to repeal basically this indictment, and they will cover protection for both in Europe, maybe not in the Middle East, but at least in Europe, in Northern America, Canada, and what have you. And they will make sure that they will procrastinate the implementation of this decision to the point, if there is a ceasefire in the future, these will be dropped as being null and void.
Indeed. And, there is a precedent now, isn't there? Because the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, is also wanted by the ICC on a warrant of alleged war crimes in Ukraine. And yet he's been able to travel, well, not entirely unhindered, but he has been able to leave his country and travel in ICC member states. So this isn't likely to change very much, is it?
No, actually not. You see, Israel, has been outraged by such a decision. How come Israel, the democratic country that is defending itself, its leaders are being indicted by the International Criminal Court? the idea, the principle, but the actual implementation, they know that is not going to be binding, and that the United States will defend it, the UK will defend it in general. But the principle of being indicted made Israel go, being outraged by the fact that how on earth Israel could be condemned from war crimes.
The US President Joe Biden, you talked about how the United States is supportive of Israel. He's said that Israel should be allowed to defend itself. Obviously not sympathetic to what the ICC has announced, but you can't expect, can you, that the Trump administration is going to be any more sympathetic, is it?
No. The Trump administration would fight such a decision and would threaten the ICC, and it will threaten from withdrawing from the ICC and will put some sanctions on the ICC, will go the 9 yards, even further than Joe Biden, once he is in power. I mean, in January, when he will be ordained as the president of the United States. So I wouldn't be surprised if Trump will take it even further in supporting Israel and defending itself, and in trying basically to decriminalize Israel on its acts of war in Gaza, because he can always justify it as Israel defending itself, and that Hamas is a terrorist, and the collective punishment and the genocide is a collateral damage is because of the terrorism of Hamas. That will be the justification of President Trump-elect, and that's why I don't anticipate any sympathy with the decision, but to fight this decision and to put pressures on the ICC by threatening the ICC, by using all kinds of extortionist methods to make this decision null and void.
And just lastly, in terms of reaction from the Palestinian side, the Palestinian ambassador to London called this announcement by the ICC a step towards accountability and justice in Palestine. Mustafa Barghouti saying this doesn't go far enough, and he says that genocide should be added to the list of crimes. Let me get your opinion. Is Benjamin Netanyahu a war criminal?
Well, actually, I mean, with the evidence that we have, with what we are seeing, with the effects on the ground, with the killing over 41,000 people, with at least 60,000, 70,000 being injured, with starvation, no food, no, total destruction of Gaza, the northern part, and the continuation of his policies of extermination of the Palestinian people, what else should we call him?
So that's a yes?
Yes.
Thank you very much. That is all we have time for. Manuel Hassassian, the Palestinian ambassador to Denmark, thank you very much for your time today.
You're welcome, sir.
Well, the situation in Gaza continues to worsen, even as the prospects for a ceasefire deal remain ever more distant. While the war has claimed the lives of more than 44,000 Palestinians since 2023, as well as displacing more than 1 million others, it's also resulted in a widespread humanitarian crisis. Well, the International Criminal Court's decision to issue this warrant has been slammed by the office of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as anti-Semitic. And President Isaac Herzog called it a dark day for justice, as he pointed to the fact that Israeli hostages remain in captivity. Well, for more on this, we can speak now to Fleur Hassan-Nahoum, who is the Israeli Special Envoy for Trade and Innovation, who joins us now from Jerusalem. Thank you very much indeed for your time today. First of all, can you just tell us what your thoughts were when you received the news of this decision by the International Criminal Court?
Well, we knew that it was very likely to come because in the summer they already announced that they're seeking to issue these arrest warrants. And again, extremely unprecedented, first of all, for the ICC to do that to a Western democracy that has its own legal system, Western liberal values. It's also unprecedented in the way that it was done, because normally they were supposed to come, Karim Khan was supposed to bring a mission to see for themselves, to come to Israel, to cross to Gaza, to actually gather evidence And all of a sudden, that trip was mysteriously cancelled. And then without any warning, which again is against any type of precedent or protocol. Normally, you warn the authorities that you're going to be issuing arrest warrants. And this is done with full knowledge. And again, he tried to use the surprise element, again, completely unprecedented. And it's absolutely ridiculous that basically what he's saying is that Israel can be attacked as brutally as anything, but Israel doesn't have the right to defend itself. Because if it does defend itself, then all of a sudden it's a war crime. Whatever precautions Israel takes, it doesn't matter. Defending yourself against a brutal attack, and I remind everyone, a war we didn't start, a war we didn't want, a war that could end in an hour if the hostages are returned, somehow that is Israel's fault. And so, yes, it does remind us of the dark days of the anti-Semitic Dreyfus trials that brought about the need for the modern state of Israel.
But doesn't all of this hinge not just on Israel's right to defend itself, but how Israel has defended itself?
I think Israel's defended itself in an exemplary manner. Which country in the world do you know eliminates its own moment of surprise in a war in order to give people warning to move them out of the way? We're dealing with an enemy. We're dealing with Hamas that is committing a double war crime. First of all, they started a war against us, killed, murdered, raped, and took hostages, innocent civilians, not military, innocent civilians. And then they use their people in order to defend themselves. Now, let me remind everyone, they have 800 kilometers of tunnels. If they really wanted to care for their people, why aren't they putting them in those tunnels for shelter?
Ironically, this is one of the very few instances of Israel and Hamas agreeing on something because, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu has slammed this decision by the International Criminal Court. Hamas has as well because one of their people has been named by the International Criminal Court for such a warrant. I mean, there's a bit of irony in there, isn't there?
Well, again, that's ridiculous. They're comparing a democratically elected leader with a terrorist. That's what they're doing. And let me just, the ICC is a court that literally doesn't have jurisdiction on the majority of the world. The larger countries of the world are not part of the ICC, and for good reason. It's a politicized kangaroo court, which has not followed any protocol, which has a budget of $200 million a year, and yet for 22 years of its existence has only managed to indict 6 people. They're all brutal dictators. People like Khamenei, who are killing women, men, children in Iran, no indictments. People like Assad from Syria killed 500,000 of his own people, gassed his own people, nothing, no indictments. And so you have to agree that it seems very arbitrary the way that they're working and who they're choosing to indict.
A kangaroo court seems a rather damning assessment of the International Criminal Court, which...
Well, if it isn't, then why aren't the biggest countries in the world, the United States, part of this?
Well, plenty of other countries are. And as we've seen...
Very few of the countries that actually conduct any type of warfare. Ultimately, this is a defensive war that Israel is fighting. The way that we fought the war is actually in an urban warfare scenario. It's completely unprecedented. Every casualty, every civilian casualty is a tragedy. But ultimately, in terms of civilian casualties compared to terrorists, it's 1 to 2, that's unprecedented in itself. When you look at the way that the war was fought against ISIS in the Middle East by Western powers, it was 9 civilians to 1 terrorist. And here we've got 1 to 1. We've got 20,000 terrorists, and using even Hamas numbers, that is very low. And again, I repeat, it is every single civilian casualty is a tragedy. But ask yourself, who put these civilians in this situation to begin with? Why did Hamas attack Israel when they knew that Israel would come to get their civilians from their dungeons and would try and dismantle the threat?
Okay, let's go to the specifics of what was announced today by the ICC. This is something they said. This chamber considers that there are reasonable grounds to believe that both individuals intentionally and knowingly deprived the civilian population of Gaza of objects indispensable to their survival, which included water, food, medicine, and medical supplies, as well as fuel and electricity. Is none of that true?
None of it is true. Why is it that we've allowed it? Ultimately, under international law, the only obligation Israel has is to facilitate the entry. We've done more than that. We've not only facilitated the entry, we've also vaccinated millions of people. And recently, and it's interesting that nobody talks about it, we know that 90 tons of food and aid was stolen at gunpoint by Hamas. And so Israel does its job to facilitate aid. What happens inside when the useless United Nations organizations that are working there and the terrorists are stealing the aid and are selling it in the open market for ridiculous amounts of money, that's already not Israel's obligation. But Israel has facilitated 1 million tons of food and medicine. And again, if Israel wanted to cut the electricity off to Gaza, it could, and we haven't. So it's all a lie. But again, why didn't they just come here themselves the way they were supposed to in May to see if there was evidence? They're doing everything from their armchair and from a very, very pernicious motivation.
Let's just talk a bit about the Hamas leader who was named by the ICC, Ibrahim Al-Masri, who's also known as Mohammed Deif. He's accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. I was just about to ask you, what do we know about where he is?
It's him and Sinwar, and we've already taken care of that. So it's a little ridiculous. And that's why it's actually, thank God we can do the work of the International Court, it seems.
13 months of warfare in Gaza, 44,000 people killed. Are you saying Hamas and Hamas alone is responsible for all of those deaths?
Absolutely. Only Hamas is responsible for the deaths of its own people, is responsible for not acting in order to protect his people. And when you have an imam from Gaza saying this, when you have the people of Gaza finally speaking out and saying Hamas have destroyed our lives, don't listen to me, let's listen to them.
But what about the civilians who really are entirely innocent in all of this? And we have to admit that civilians are entirely innocent.
The civilians are the innocent casualties of a war that should never have started, of a war that started in order to target only Israeli civilians, to scare Israel. And I pray that the people of Gaza, the innocent people of Gaza, get better leaders. Because for 20 years, not just now, for 20 years, they've lived under a repressive dictatorship. They had one election in 2005, and then Hamas took over. And so I pray that the people of Gaza, for them, they have better leadership. And in general, I pray that the Palestinian people have better leadership, because all they've had so far are either genocidal leaders that want to destroy the state of Israel and have never really accepted that we're not going anywhere, or corrupt leaders that have become billionaires on the back of their pain and suffering.
But can we be really surprised when you look at the conditions of people in Gaza for the last several decades? I mean, people who were born there haven't known one day that would look like a normal day for anyone else anywhere in the world, have they?
But whose fault is that? Israel left Gaza in 2005.
But this goes back. This goes back decades.
When Israel unilaterally withdrew, it's supposed to be responsible. Don't they want autonomy? Don't they want a state? Gaza could have been the perfect pilot state. It could have been Dubai. It could have been. It's in the Mediterranean coast, and instead, with all the aid money, with all the investment, they decided to build 800 kilometers of tunnels instead of building the new Dubai. Why couldn't they have built the new Dubai and give their people a wonderful, wonderful life? No, instead they allied themselves with the Islamic Republic of Iran. They took all the aid money, billions and billions of dollars with zero accountability, and they built tunnels and started stockpiling weapons and preparing themselves for war. Does that sound fair to you?
Well, I mean, what doesn't sound fair is that millions of people are paying the price for the actions of a minority. And shouldn't Israel recognize that?
Well, unfortunately, Hamas was paying off half of the population in the Strip. And the people who really suffered are the people that weren't affiliated to Hamas. Whenever there was any type of dissent, there's no freedom of speech there, of course. Whenever there was any type of dissent, those people were brutally killed. Recently, we saw very disturbing footage of what they did to their own political dissenters in the Gaza Strip. So it is actually a mini Islamic Republic of Iran that they were running over there.
Just want to ask you, because we haven't got much time, there's another legal battle that Israel faces at the top UN court, the International Court of Justice. I just wonder if you think that's also a kangaroo court. And that is, of course, a case that South Africa has brought against Israel, accusing the country of genocide. What do you make of that?
Well, it's that the case is falling apart. South Africa asked for an extension to provide more evidence because they can't find any. And we all know that South Africa is basically using its status in order to be the mouthpiece of the Islamic Republic of Iran and Qatar. The cases are falling apart, and if they have any integrity, they'll see that for themselves.
So you don't think that either case will have any, do you think either case will have any consequence for Prime Minister Netanyahu in particular? Because if countries do comply, will he have difficulty? Will he have freedom of movement if he's with such a warrant in place?
Well, that's a good question. The question is, how is the world going to react? How are the countries that are actually not part of the ICC and that themselves could face recriminations like the one that we've seen against Israel? Will the United States now use their own power, their own soft power, their own legal power to punish the ICC in order for that not to happen to them? I certainly hope so. And I hope that these countries completely ignore these arrest warrants because they're completely unprecedented, completely biased. And this, if a Western country with liberal values, a democracy like Israel, can have this happen to them, then any country, any democratic country is basically under threat of not being able to defend themselves against an aggressive neighbor, which is exactly what's happened to us.
And just lastly, I mean, there are reported to be tens of thousands of people on the brink of starvation in northern Gaza. And I just want to ask you specifically about starvation, because it's spelt out as being a war crime if it's used as a method of warfare. What do you say about this?
Well, Israel is not deliberately starving anybody. We're allowing and facilitating food going in. Once the food goes in, if Hamas are stealing that food at gunpoint, which we know that they did last week, then that is certainly Hamas who's responsible. And it's certainly no policy of the Israeli government to use starvation as a method of war. That is a complete lie and fabrication.
OK, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. Fleur, Hassan-Nahoum, thank you indeed.
Thank you.
Now, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that Russia likely launched an armed intercontinental ballistic missile at the city of Dnipro today. While Zelensky accuses the Russian leader Vladimir Putin of using Ukraine as a weapons testing ground. Well, this follows earlier reports that said that the missile launched by Russia was ballistic, but not an ICBM. Well, Ukrainian air defenses shot down 6 Kh-101 cruise missiles during the attack. Well, the launch is the latest sign of mounting tensions in the war after Ukraine fired US and British-supplied missiles at targets in Russia. Well, for more, we can cross to Kyiv now and speak to Olena Sotnyk, who is a former MP and advisor to the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Russia is reported to have launched these intercontinental ballistic missiles today at Ukraine. It's the first time, we gather, this type of powerful weapon has been used in the conflict. What more can you tell us about that and the level of damage that it caused?
First of all, I think that it is about geopolitical damage for those who really care about international agreements, international rules, because with this, Russia demonstrated that they can blur the lines of international law and treaties. It's not like, of course, a tactic nuclear weapon, but still it is kind of the signal that they can use intercontinental weapon without using air support. So for thousands of kilometers. For us, it's not just a threat to Ukraine now. It's already threat and very clear threat, very clear signal to all our partners, and I think that reaction should be, very harsh. And even those who've been somehow flexible with Putin and thinking about getting agreement with him. They should be now very direct that this is the red line, and Russia is like playing with very dangerous kind of risks and possible reactions, and possible like ruining the balance of also nuclear deterrence is there. So we should be very cautious about that. And for sure, that's kind of more psychological threat. It is attempt, first of all, to put pressure on Ukraine, to threaten people, to threaten civil population, first of all, because what Russians doing for the last month, they're just hitting civilian areas. They're hitting residential houses without any limitations.
Sure, and I wanted to ask you about the significance of Dnipro. It's a city in the central eastern area of Ukraine, and it's been the target of quite frequent Russian attacks lately, and I'm just wondering why you think that is.
First of all, because that's one of the biggest cities not on the front lines, but near the front lines, with all the capacities which supporting, first of all, humanitarian support, medical centers are there, and they're helping to those who, for example, relocated from front lines. There are a lot of IDPs living in this city. There are a lot of, as I said, hospitals there which supporting people who've been wounded, both civilians and military people. And of course, it is, one of the main cities in terms of logistics, in terms of helping to east of Ukraine. And it's one of the also of the biggest economic centers. And when you are a country in the war and your budget is really stretched and GDP is very important to continue the fight, and Ukraine really has a huge deficit. Economic center like Dnipro also very important. That's why, of course, Russia is trying to break this line. They are trying to break the economic stability in order to somehow to stretch Ukrainian capacity to fight.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to ask you whether you think this attack using this type of weaponry by Russia is a sort of a direct response to the attacks on Russian territory using these more powerful US and British missiles that have been used in the last couple of days. Is that the way it looks to you?
For me, taking into account, there is no evidence for now, but just different military experts who are analyzing the trajectory of the missile, intercontinental missile hit, and in general the characteristics of this hit, that it was more kinesthetic than explosion threat. And it means that what is Putin trying to do? He's trying to showcase that he is more powerful than he is in reality. And for sure that now he has the only one argument nowadays, to threaten those who are vulnerable. I mean, civilians, ordinary people in the cities, which are not maybe defended as strong as, for example, Kyiv or other cities in Ukraine. And he is attacking, for example, Kryvyi Rih or Sumy, cities near the forefront, and they're attacking civilian areas. What they're trying to do, they're trying just, to frighten us, to frighten people. But in reality, that's everything about demonstrating additionally that there is no military capacity to win, but there is very terroristic style of approach to terrorize civilians, to terrorize cities, and to showcase probably mighty, but as we can see, there is nothing there in terms of the military capacity.
Let's just examine this decision by the British and the Americans to greenlight the use of these weapons. I mean, obviously there's been a lot happening in the United States in the last few weeks, and it's reported, that in his final 2 months in office, President Biden really wants to try to get Ukraine into a strong position ahead of eventual negotiations. Is that how it looks to you?
Yeah, that's true that we are trying to, we are trying to persuade our partners to take the right decision, which should be taken like long time ago. And I think that's one of the main problems of kind of support of Ukraine. Because like the right decisions, they are taken sooner or later, but rather later than at the moment when we need it. And that's what we can see, for example, with the counteroffensive operation in summer, which could be much more successful if our partners would support us earlier. And we didn't lose this time when Russia built their, fortifications, etc., etc. Then we had this problem with the glade bombs, and of course we would urged much earlier our partners that we need proper air defense in order, to somehow to oppose this kind of weapons, which is like really problematic both on the forefront, but to protect civilians. And we just received, air defense aircrafts. I mean, like a few months ago. So, and now we are talking about long-range weapons. How you can win the war if the logistics centers near the forefront? It's almost impossible. And then we've been talking about that for the last 2.5 years. And and just now we are receiving partial permission to use it. I think that's the main case. That probably, like when we are hearing about red lines, but then our partners, they decide, okay, that's the moment when Russia already crossed all the red lines, and they're giving us some permissions or some support. But the question is time, and it's very important that this decision should be taken in time.
Yeah, I just want to ask you, I mean, do you think one of the red lines as far as Washington was concerned was the fact that Russia is now deploying North Korean troops to the region? Do you think that for Washington was a line that's crossed that meant perhaps Washington had to respond by saying, right, okay, Ukraine, you can now use this weaponry? Do you think that was a turning point?
I don't know if it was a turning point, but I can tell you that in general, for the international perception of the Russian war in Ukraine, we should already be cautious that it's becoming now not like regional war, but it's becoming international. And the main worry of United States, of course, was always China and Asia. And now when, it is a clear triangle of Iran and North Korea involved and Russia in the same, in the same level of raising the risks. I think that it's time to understand that there is no division between these different regional wars. It is everything in one package, and if we want to somehow deter this, and if we want to prevent huge escalation, the way how to deal with that's the way how to deal with the international conflicts, where already Asia threat of risk, Asia threat of conflict is already there, because we have fact of deployed North Korean military forces, and it's becoming really frustrating and probably more decisive movement needed.
I mean, we're 33 months into this war now. This week we passed the 1,000-day mark of conflict, and it really feels, looking at it from the outside, that things are coming to some sort of a a conclusion, that things are escalating to the point that they've got to come to some sort of an end? Just so much back in the news cycle in the last couple of weeks. I mean, is that how things feel where you sit in Kyiv?
The war continues and people dies, and we continue to fight for each centimeter of our territory. I just want to remind you that like thousands of Ukrainians on the occupied territories now, and they under the threat of death, tortures, etc., etc. So it is very hard to say that we are coming to conclusion. What kind of conclusion? That's the main question. Like, do we want to just cross the line between these people and Ukrainian territories which controlled by Ukraine? I think that's probably against all the principles of international law and against everything what we've been fighting for. So I wouldn't say like this. It's very difficult moment when, a lot of unclarity, a lot of frustration because of the different political cycles in different countries. Basically, I'm talking about United States and some European countries. Like we can see that, it's like more like internal policy is becoming more important than international or external threat. And I think that it should be frustrating for everyone who is taking care about the future stability of the continent, but also about the future stability of the world in general.
Yeah, but I mean, I think what I was getting at as well is the fact that, in 2 months from now, there'll be a new president in the United States. And you allude to that as well. And of course, Donald Trump saying he's going to end this war. And I'm just wondering how people in Ukraine think he's going to do that and at what price?
That's a very good question. Of course, we can have a lot of scenarios, but I can tell you what will work. The only one decision that Ukraine is a main member of NATO, because any other decisions and to stop the to have the ceasefire, for example, doesn't mean to stop the war. And to stop the war, you need to have effective measures and effective methods of deterrence, and you need security guarantees. And NATO is the only one security guarantee which can somehow gave us perspective of safety and not repetition of the invasion in the future. And then the question is if Biden is ready to move on and to talk about Ukrainian membership in NATO. That's the main question.
But in terms of the territorial price, I mean, at the moment, 1/5 of Ukrainian territory is under Russian control. I mean, do you imagine a day, or do you think it's realistic that Russia is going to relinquish control of areas of the country that it's captured?
Yeah, but that's all depends on on the general strategy of our partners and Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting for their territories. It is about our sovereignty. It is about international law. Like there is nothing to discuss. The question is, of course, we are dependent from our partners, and what would be the general solution? What would be, the understanding of the future of this world? Because, okay, if people, or for example, United States or Trump is ready to put pressure on Ukraine to give up on the territories, he should expect that the same could happen in other areas, in other regions. And then the question was the possible, conflict in Taiwan. Then how he will deal with that. So I can't tell you because it's for sure not Ukrainian interest. And Ukrainian interest to restore the sovereignty, to restore the control over our territory, and first of all, to provide guarantee for Ukrainian people who are staying on this occupied territories without law, without any guarantees of security.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we're out of time, but I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Olena Sotnyk, thank you very much indeed for your time today.
Thank you. Bye.
Well, for more analysis, we can cross now to London and speak to General David Richards, former UK Chief of the Defence Staff. Lord Richards, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. We're getting these reports that suggest that Ukraine has now fired UK-supplied long-range Storm Shadow cruise missiles at Russia for the very first time. Moscow saying it's shot some of these missiles down. Does all of this sound credible to you? And if so, how significant is this?
I think it's certainly credible. Our Prime Minister seemed to be keen to do this a number of weeks ago, but had to wait for President Biden to give authority to use American ATACMS, because there's a linkage to the guidance systems that the British use for their Storm Shadow. So I think it's the case. I mean, we'll, as ever, and I learned this as a soldier of many years, you know, you never believe first reports, but I think it probably is credible and has now happened. The significance, we would say that it might have tactical significance. That's, if you like, local importance. But in terms of the eventual outcome of the war, i.e. the strategic level, I doubt it'll have much value.
So you don't see this as being the major escalation that some in Moscow are calling it?
I can see why the Russians would view it as an escalation, because it does bring Western weapons, allows Western weapons to be fired into and onto Russian territory. So that is an escalation of kinds, but and it will annoy them. There's no doubt about it. They thought they weren't going to have that extra headache because they've already moved a lot of their logistic bases and air bases further east to get out of this possible quandary. But why I say I don't think it's of huge significance is that at the end of the day, it's not going to cause Russia to lose the war. It might put Ukraine into a better bargaining position for when, as even now President Zelensky seems to concede, President-elect Trump comes to power and decides to impose in some way a ceasefire.
Do you think Washington and London were right to give these weapons to Ukraine and the green light to now use them on Russian territory?
Well, I think one could argue that it's too little and too late. And it sounds now, it can appear to some people, it's a little bit sort of a panicky reaction on the back of President Trump winning the election. If this had happened 2 years ago, then I think it could have had much greater significance. The problem that Ukraine has faced from the start is that Western nations, particularly the US, Britain, France, have encouraged President Zelensky and the Ukrainians to fight a war without giving them the means to actually win it. I think that is strategically questionable, but also morally questionable, because people are dying on a daily basis in the hope of achieving a victory that in practice will be very difficult to achieve. So I think I'm with President Trump insofar as now is the time to draw a line under this one way or another. Clearly, Ukraine wants to be in as good a position as she can be at the point that line is drawn. But to go on fighting, and some people talk about a frozen war, means there'll be a very unstable and increasingly unstable situation in Eastern Europe. Mistakes will happen. People do silly things. And suddenly, you know, the thing has got a lot worse. So I think now is the time, unless NATO nations are prepared to enter the war themselves, and I don't think that's going to happen for good reason, then now is the time to start talking about a ceasefire.
Earlier this week, we spoke to a spokesperson for Vladimir Putin, Sergei Markov, who said that people in the UK could be spending Christmas in a bomb shelter. He seemed to suggest that a NATO-Russian confrontation was quite likely by making that comment.
Well, I think, first of all, the only person that really matters is President Putin. Why would he do that when Mr. Trump is about to take over the reins of power? He will not want added problems in terms of resolving this problem. the war in Ukraine. So I doubt personally that is likely to happen. And anyway, that would be, and what he implies in it, a major escalation, which would draw NATO into the war directly, as opposed to the indirect manner in which he is interpreting the use of these Western weapons.
Yeah, the comments were made in the context of the loosening of the nuclear doctrine. I just want to pick up on something you said earlier on this year. You were amongst a group of former defence and security chiefs in the UK who said the British Army must, quote, prepare genuinely for war. You made those comments 8 months ago, and I'm just wondering whether you think that since then the UK is looking more prepared and whether you think the threat is looking greater.
Well, look, I'm the biggest peacenik of all time, like a lot of, I think, reasonably good generals, because we've seen a bit of war. The whole point of preparing for war is not to fight it, God forbid, but to be strong enough to make one's potential adversary not want to take us on. And I think what we've got to remember in the case of Russia and Ukraine is that strategically, Russia has lost. NATO today is stronger, more united than NATO was 3 years ago. They have got hold of the 4 oblasts, or the bulk of the 4 oblasts in the east of Ukraine, and they've retained Crimea. But I don't think one could argue that strategically they've won. But we don't want to take a risk. And therefore, NATO nations now have a period in which they have got to make sure that should Russia up the ante again in some way, I've always personally felt it unlikely, but we shouldn't take the risk by making sure our own armed forces are more than up to any challenge that could be offered by Russia. But look, I'm like a lot of good guys. I said I want to avoid a war. I'm not encouraging one. I think it's time to draw a line under this broadly in the way that I understand President Trump is intending. And that seems to me a very sensible thing to do.
All right, well, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Lord Richards. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Now, Poland says it has scrambled fighter jets and mobilized its forces in response to a Russian missile and drone attack on Ukraine. This as Russia claims that a new US ballistic missile defense base in northern Poland is going to lead to an increase in the overall level of nuclear danger. Well, Poland's foreign ministry spokesperson says that the base serves the purpose of defense and not to attack. Well, for more, we can speak now to Daniel Fried, who is a former Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs and a former US ambassador to Poland. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. Poland, of course, a country you know well. It's a member of NATO as well. We're being told that Warsaw is on the highest state of readiness and they're scrambling these fighter jets near their border with Ukraine. Do you think we're seeing here the beginnings of an expansion of this conflict?
I don't think we are seeing an expansion to the degree that Poland would be drawn into the conflict. The Poles take security seriously. Their history teaches them that they must, and they have a serious military. They're no longer a small, poor country on the margins of Europe. They're a serious player. They take their security seriously. They scramble their jets because they don't want to see Russian missiles or drones flying into Poland. That said, they are unlikely to try to enter the war, and they will almost certainly not do so on their own. So I think that the Poles scrambling their planes is a prudent and serious move, but not any kind of escalation. I think that it may be in Putin's interest to create fears of escalation in Europe and the United States, so he can argue that peace on his terms is needed. That's what I think is going on here. But I think the Poles are absolutely right to take precautions, but these are serious people. They're not going to make any foolish moves.
It's easy to understand, though, why they feel so vulnerable, being so much closer to the conflict than pretty much every other country in Europe.
Well, the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Romanians take this war seriously, and they are absolutely right to. The Poles the Baltic countries have been warning the Germans, NATO, and the US for many years that we needed to take the possibility of Russian aggression seriously. They were right. They were right all along. And those who thought that they had exaggerated the Russian threat or were Russophobes or emotional were just foolish. The Poles were right. And they are in a position now to be part of the NATO and transatlantic core decision makers about what we do next with Ukraine and for Ukraine.
And of course, they've got this new base, this air defense base that's opened in northern Poland just this week. It's not new news. It was an expected and long in the making, long in the construction base, but presumably extremely reassuring for Poland to have that at this particular moment.
The Poles have welcomed U.S. military presence in Poland, and there is a national consensus in Poland about increasing their military expenditures. Before Russia started its war of conquest against Ukraine, the U.S. had almost no military presence in Poland at all. Now we have, as I said, over 10,000 troops in Poland. And they are there because Russia has started a war of aggression, and we take our responsibilities seriously as Poland's NATO ally and a country that wants to see Russian aggression stopped.
Just speaking about NATO, I mean, obviously a degree of nervousness amongst NATO members about what the new administration in Washington has got planned. Just before we talk about that, let's talk about what you think the Biden administration is trying to achieve in its final 2 months, because a lot has been announced during the course of the last couple of days. What do you think President Biden is trying to achieve, specifically with regards to Ukraine, as he prepares to leave the White House?
There's no mystery. I think the Biden people are trying to send as many weapons as they can to Ukraine, including lift restrictions that should have never been imposed on Ukraine's use of those weapons. I also expect the Biden administration will launch additional economic measures to put pressure on Russia. I'd be surprised if they didn't. They're trying to put, as they have said, Ukraine in the best possible position as the Trump administration takes office. There's no mystery here. I wish the Biden people had done more and faster, but I welcome what they've done.
Indeed, there's an article that you wrote just a few days ago in Just Security, and you say the Biden administration did a lot to support Ukraine's defense, rallying European and other nations to do the same. I don't share the cynical view that the Biden administration was stingy. But what you do seem to be saying is that perhaps by sending important weaponry or giving the green light for important weaponry at this late stage, it was late in the day.
I think that's right. I think the Biden administration was agonizingly and unnecessarily slow each time it had to make a decision about sending sophisticated weapons to Ukraine, F-16s or tanks or HIMARS tactical rockets or ATACMS or the permission to use ATACMS. I think the Biden administration overthought the problem. They did a lot. I want to give them credit, but I think they were slow. I think part of the slowness was that they didn't really think at first that Ukraine had a chance to defend itself. The Biden administration was spot on accurate, just nailed it when it came to Russia's intention to invade. But they were wrong about the outcome of that invasion. They thought the Ukrainians would lose quickly, that they would fight bravely and die fast. That was wrong. The Ukrainians stopped the Russian offensive. The Russians never got near Kyiv. The Ukrainians pushed back the Russians. I think we should have moved with more weapons faster in the early days. But to be fair to the Biden administration, we weren't prepared for such an eventuality. We never thought that Ukraine had a chance in a full-scale war against Russia, and we came around only by slow steps to realizing that the Ukrainians had a chance.
And of course, the authorization of the use and the delivery of ATACMS by the United States came with a certain amount of fanfare and an announcement that this had been done. And we've spoken to analysts on this channel who've said that it would be better not to make announcements and just to hand over the weaponry without making an announcement. What do you think is the purpose of announcing such a thing before you do it?
Well, you know, I have great sympathy for those who said we should have let the ATACMS announce themselves. What happened was a leak, and I don't know whether it was an authorized leak or not. The story appeared in the press that the Biden administration had finally given the Ukrainians permission to use ATACMS inside Russia. And then there was a period where the Biden administration didn't confirm it, and finally the Ukrainians did use it. I think as a tactical matter, it would be better to say less about provision of weapons, say nothing about escalatory dangers, but simply allow the weapons to announce themselves. That said, here we are, and I think the Biden administration is going out the door, doing the best it can, and eyes are shifting to the Trump administration to see what they will do.
Indeed, and the Russians don't tend to announce things either, such as the introduction of North Korean troops onto the battlefield. That was obviously discovered.
No kidding.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that's been a game changer?
Militarily, I don't think so. I don't think that the North Koreans have had a decisive impact on the battlefield, at least not yet. The Russians' use of North Korean soldiers demonstrates that Putin is unwilling to mobilize Russian young men in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other major Russian cities to fight his war of aggression in Ukraine. That tells you something about his real calculation of what Russians feel about the war. If they were genuinely behind it, he would mobilize. But they're not, so he won't. He brings in North Korean troops. That is ultimately a sign of weakness. It's not clear to me how the Korean troops will fight. No, the Ukrainians might find ways to entice them to come over. We shall see.
Let's look forwards to what happens in the next couple of months. Do you think Donald Trump has got a peace plan?
Well, there's no mystery that the Trump team has sketched out elements of their diplomatic approach to end this phase of the conflict. No mystery at all. J.D. Vance outlined it. It's something like a ceasefire in place, some either temporary or longer-term prohibition on Ukraine entering NATO, which I think is a foolish commitment to make. Doesn't matter what I think. And third, and this is important, J.D. Vance said that the line of contact, the new agreed line should be fortified to prevent the Russians from resuming their offensive. That's important because if the Trump plan is to be workable, Ukraine has to be supplied with weapons. And I think European troops and other troops should be sent to Ukraine to help monitor and enforce a ceasefire. And those troops would require some American backing. Now, that latter point is not part of the Trump peace plan, but a couple of European foreign ministers have already raised this as a possibility. So it's not difficult to imagine what the Trump plan could look like. What the Russian reaction is, I can't say. The initial Russian reaction to the Trump administration feelers about this sort of thing was hostile. They essentially demanded in public, not the Russian government, but Russian Kremlin-aligned spokesman, demanded basically Ukraine's surrender. I don't know that Donald Trump would accept that kind of an arrogant answer from the Kremlin. If he comes forward with a plan, he might well say that if the Russians reject it, he will double down on support for Ukraine. This is possible. Not saying it's going to happen, but there are possibilities open for a tougher Trump position than the Russians might hope for.
And of course, Ukraine's got plenty of allies in Europe, but I'm just wondering whether you think they are...
It sure does.
Do you think they're going to exert influence on the incoming Trump administration to perhaps make him reconsider? He hasn't sounded sympathetic to Ukraine over the years, I think it's fair to say. And do you think they might help him to reconsider?
They might. We started out discussing Poland. Poland has the standing, the Polish government and the Polish president have the standing with Trump world to make these points. The Polish president, Andrzej Duda, had a good relationship with Trump when he was president. And I think that President Duda is planning to visit Mar-a-Lago. The Polish government is politically very different from the president, but the Polish foreign minister is very smart and knows Americans really well. The Polish prime minister has reached out to Europeans, and the Polish foreign minister just hosted the European Big Five countries, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, in Warsaw to discuss a number of critical topics, chief among them Ukraine. So the Poles are preparing, rallying European support. The Germans have been very supportive of Ukraine, but their government, all off divided, has now fallen. They're in an election cycle. It'll be hard for them to show leadership. Macron has been excellent in support of Ukraine, though France hasn't done as much as it could. But Macron's political position is also not strong. The British have been very good on Ukraine. And so is Italy. So you can see that most of the Europeans are either favorably disposed and politically committed, or at least favorably disposed toward Ukraine. So there's something to work with. The Trump people will insist that Europe does more for Ukraine. And I think that they're right. The Europeans do need to stand up more, and they do need to increase their defense spending. The Poles have already done so. So I think that there is some trade space for the Europeans to work with the incoming Trump administration to support Ukraine. And I think this process is already in motion.
Just lastly, I mean, we were talking about how NATO allies are anticipating, and they have been anticipating for some time, the reality, now immediate reality, of Donald Trump's return. Do you think their nervousness is in any way justified?
Sure, it's justified. There are people in Trump world who have expressed contempt for NATO, contempt for Europe. Trump occasionally talks about hitting the Europeans economically. That may not be where they land, but that is certainly what they've said from time to time. We'll see how this works out. Marco Rubio, the future nominee for Secretary of State, is pretty solid, has a good reputation in Europe. I think that the new National Security Advisor, Congressman Walz, is also a serious person, but we'll see where the Trump administration's lands.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us.
pleasure.
Daniel Fried, it's been great speaking to you.
Thanks for the opportunity. Bye.
Well, that is all we have time for today's edition of Global News Today. Thanks for watching. Do join us again tomorrow. Meanwhile, bye-bye.